My name is Doctor Alani Gelb. For 17 years, I was a senior oceanographer with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, better known as NOAA. I mapped the seafloor. I studied hydrothermal vents. I was a scientist, a civilian, a woman who believed in peer-reviewed data and the steady, incremental march of human knowledge. I now live in a small, anonymous house in a town that doesn't matter, under a name that is not my own. I have not seen the ocean in 20 years. I can't. The sight of it, the vast, blue, indifferent expanse of it, brings on a panic so profound I cannot breathe. I'm recording this testimony today, on the 20th anniversary of the event, because I have learned that the United States Navy is dispatching a new, deep-submergence vehicle, the Trident, to the same coordinates we were mapping in 2002. They are calling it a deep-sea salvage and recovery exercise. That is a lie. They are not going to salvage anything. They are going to see if the prisoner is still missing. And someone needs to be on the record. Someone needs to tell the world what we found down there, in the deepest, darkest, most inaccessible place on Earth. I keep this recording equipment in a lead-lined box in my basement. That's probably paranoia, a pointless affectation. But after what I've been through, a little paranoia feels like a healthy survival instinct. My hands are steady as I operate the controls, but there is a tremor deep inside me, a low-frequency vibration of a fear that has never gone away. They told us what we saw was a state secret, a matter of grave national security. They debriefed us for weeks in a windowless room at a secure facility in the Virginia countryside that was probably owned by the CIA. They were polite, professional, and utterly terrifying. They didn't threaten us. They just explained. They explained that our careers, our pensions, our very ability to exist in the modern world were contingent on our absolute and total silence. My internal baggage is not guilt. I didn't create the thing we found. My baggage is the burden of knowledge. The knowledge that humanity is not alone at the top of the food chain. The knowledge that we built a cage for something we couldn't kill, and that for the last 20 years, that cage has been empty. I'm breaking my silence now because of that press release about the USS Trident. It was a small article buried on page 12 of a naval acquisitions journal, but the coordinates they listed for the exercise, they were a perfect match. They are going back, which can only mean one thing. Something has happened. Another ship has gone missing. Another deep-sea cable has been mysteriously cut. Another one of their SOSUS listening posts has picked up a sound that isn't supposed to exist. The monster is stirring again, and they are sending a new team of jailers to check the cell. The world needs to know what we found at the bottom of the Philippine Trench. They need to know about the wreck that was bigger than any submarine ever built. They need to know why a military vessel designed for war had no weapons, no torpedo tubes, no missile hatches. And they need to know why, instead of a command center and an engine room, its entire interior was a single, massive, supermax prison cell. They need to know that the hole in its side was not from a torpedo. It was torn open from the inside. The official report on our expedition, the one that was released to the public, states that we suffered a catastrophic failure of our multi-beam sonar array, resulting in corrupted data and a premature end to the mission. That is a lie. A neat, tidy, and comprehensive lie. The truth is down there, 7 miles deep. A monument to a secret so terrible the Pentagon has spent half a century trying to forget it exists. The truth is a shipwreck. But the wreck wasn't a tomb. It was a prison. And the prisoner is gone. I was 38 years old at the top of my professional career, and I still believed that the deepest parts of the ocean held nothing but cold and darkness and pressure. That was my first mistake. Our journey to the anomaly began like any other scientific expedition. It was a journey of logistics, of grant proposals, of checklists. It was a journey to the other side of the world, to the deep, warm waters of the Pacific. Our vessel was the RV Odyssey, one of NOAA's premier research ships. A beautiful, ugly, brutally functional ship, 220 feet of floating laboratory, packed to the gills with the most advanced oceanographic equipment in the world. Our mission, funded by a joint grant from the National Science Foundation and the Office of Naval Research, was a simple one: to conduct a high-resolution bathymetric survey of a previously unmapped section of the Philippine Trench. It was pure science, blue sky research. We were simply trying to fill in a blank spot on the map. There was no hint of the darkness we were about to stumble into. The journey was long and monotonous. We sailed from Honolulu, a multi-week transit across the vast, empty expanse of the Pacific. The sensory experience of a long sea voyage is one of hypnotic repetition. The endless, deep blue of the water, the vast, empty bowl of the sky, the constant, gentle rocking of the ship, a cradle that never stops, the steady, low thrum of the diesel engines, a sound that becomes the background music of your life, a sound you only notice when it stops. Our world shrank to the confines of the ship. Our crew was a familiar cast of characters. There was Captain Larson, a stoic Swede who had spent 40 years at sea and had a face that looked like it was carved from driftwood. There was my chief technician, a young, brilliant, and pathologically cynical man named Ben Carter. Ben was the scientist archetype in its purest form. He believed only in data. If you couldn't measure it, plot it on a graph, and run a regression analysis on it, it wasn't real. He treated the ocean not as a place of mystery, but as a complex fluid dynamics problem that just needed a big enough computer to solve. The journey was a chance for me to interact with Ben, a long, atmospheric dialogue that stretched over many nights on the ship's bridge, under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed to tear holes in the fabric of the night. Ben was a skeptic, but he was also a collector of stories. He was fascinated by the strange, unexplained things that happen at sea. "You know, Alani," he said to me one night, leaning against the rail, a mug of coffee in his hands. "The old maps, the ones from the age of sail, they used to mark places like this with a warning. Here be dragons. We laugh at that now. We call them superstitious. But what if they weren't? What if they were just literal? What if they saw something down there that their minds couldn't process, and a dragon was the closest word they had for it?" I smiled, playing the role of the senior, more grounded scientist. "They were seeing undiscovered whale species, Ben, or giant squid, or tricks of the light on the water. We have science now. We have sonar. We don't need dragons." He took a sip of his coffee. "Maybe," he said, his eyes on the dark, impenetrable water below. "But the Navy still loses submarines, don't they? The USS Scorpion, the USS Thresher, they just vanish. And the official reports are always full of redacted pages. What if they're not hitting seamounts or suffering from mechanical failure? What if they're just running into a dragon?" His stories were folklore, the modern myths of the deep ocean. But he told one story, a rumor he'd heard from a friend at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, that stuck with me. It was about a deep-sea listening array, one of the Navy's SOSUS arrays that had been planted in this very trench back in the 70s. According to the rumor, the array worked perfectly for about a week, and then it started picking up a sound, a single, repeating, low-frequency pulse, a sound that had the acoustic signature of something biological, but something that was, according to the analysis, miles long. After 2 days of recording this impossible sound, the array went permanently silent. The official report said it was destroyed by a subterranean landslide. Ben's friend said the last thing the array recorded was the sound of its own titanium casing being, in his words, crushed like a tin can. I debunked it, of course. I gave him a dozen rational explanations. A malfunctioning sensor creating a false reading, an unusual volcanic event. But the story, the detail of something miles long, lingered in the back of my mind, a small, unsettling splinter of doubt. The first, undeniable sign that things were about to go profoundly wrong happened when we arrived at our survey area and began to deploy our equipment. Our primary tool was the multi-beam sonar array, a sophisticated system that painted a three-dimensional picture of the seafloor. As we lowered the sonar fish into the water, our primary navigation systems began to fail. The GPS signal, usually rock solid, began to fluctuate wildly, then went dead. The ship's magnetic compasses, all three of them, began to spin, slowly at first, then faster and faster, until their needles were just a useless, frantic blur. Captain Larson was baffled. "I've never seen anything like it," he said, his voice a low, worried rumble. "It's like we've sailed into a magnetic dead zone." Ben was ecstatic. "It's a magnetic anomaly. A massive, previously undiscovered metallic ore deposit on the seafloor. This is huge, Alani. We're going to be famous." He was already dreaming of the scientific papers he would write. I was less certain. The anomaly was too powerful, too localized. It felt wrong. But we pressed on. We had inertial navigation, and we were here to map the bottom. We began our survey, the ship moving in a slow, precise grid pattern, the multi-beam sonar sending its fan of sound waves down into the abyss. For the first few hours, the seafloor was exactly what we expected. A vast, abyssal plain of mud and silt, sloping gently down into the deeper parts of the trench. It was a landscape of profound, empty desolation. And then, the first anomaly appeared on Ben's screen. It was a single, massive, and impossibly geometric object lying on the seafloor at a depth of nearly 7 miles. Far, far deeper than any natural rock formation should be. "What in God's name is that?" I whispered, leaning over his shoulder. The object was long, cylindrical, perfectly symmetrical. It was a submarine. A massive, colossal submarine, half buried in the silt, in a part of the ocean where the pressure was over 16,000 pounds per square inch. A pressure that should have crushed any man-made object into a ball of scrap metal. But there it was, impossibly intact. The gates of the deep had opened, and they had revealed something that was not supposed to exist. Our destination, this isolated patch of ocean, felt like it had been holding its breath, waiting for someone to finally find the terrible secret it was hiding. The discovery of the wreck threw the Odyssey into a state of controlled chaos. The sonar image on Ben's screen was the center of our universe. We stared at it, a group of scientists confronted with an object that defied every known law of naval engineering and materials science. The thing was immense, far larger than any submarine ever built. From the sonar readings, we estimated its length at over 800 feet, nearly twice the size of a modern Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine, and its depth, 7 miles down. The pressure at that depth is so extreme, it would turn a human body into a thimbleful of liquid. A military submarine would be crushed into a pretzel at less than half that depth. This thing was built of materials we couldn't even imagine. Our first assumption, the only one that made any logical sense, was that it was a lost, top-secret Soviet prototype from the height of the Cold War. A Typhoon class on steroids, a monster sub that had suffered a catastrophic failure during a deep-diving test and had been lost to the abyss, its existence denied by the Kremlin. This was the most rational explanation. And it was our duty, as both scientists and as American citizens, to investigate. The process of arriving at the anomaly, of making first contact, was slow and deliberate. The site was 7 miles straight down. The only way to get there was with our ROV. Our remotely operated vehicle was a machine named Hades, a marvel of modern engineering. It was a refrigerator-sized robot, bristling with high-definition cameras, powerful lights, manipulator arms, and a suite of scientific sensors. It was our eyes and hands in the deep. Prepping Hades for a dive this deep was a long, methodical process. Ben and his team of technicians spent hours going over every system, checking every seal, testing every circuit. We were operating by the book, following our deep dive protocols to the letter. This disciplined, procedural approach was our only defense against the profound, terrifying wrongness of what we were about to do. We were about to poke a stick at a dragon. The deployment of Hades was a tense, quiet affair. The massive A-frame crane on the Odyssey's stern lifted the ROV from its cradle and swung it out over the dark, churning water. For a moment, it hung there, a bright yellow metal beast suspended between our world of air and light and the world of darkness and pressure below. Then, with a soft splash that seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence, it was in the water. The dive itself took hours. Hades descended at a controlled pace, its powerful thrusters pushing it down into the crushing blackness. We were all gathered in the ROV control room, a small, dark space filled with the glow of monitors. The room was our bubble, our spaceship, our only link to our robotic proxy in that alien world. The main screen showed the view from Hades' primary camera, a steady descent through a blizzard of marine snow, the constant, gentle rain of organic detritus from the surface world. As we descended, the wrongness of the environment began to assert itself. The magnetic anomaly we had detected on the surface grew stronger. The ROV's own compass began to spin uselessly. The water temperature, which should have been just above freezing at this depth, was warmer. Not by much, just a few degrees, but it was a discrepancy that had no scientific explanation. The water itself seemed off. The quality of the light from the ROV's powerful lamps seemed to be absorbed, to be dampened by the water, casting short, muted beams into a darkness that felt absolute and hungry. I felt that same irrational sensation I'd felt on the surface, the feeling of being watched. Not by a creature, but by the ocean itself. A feeling that we were intruding into a place that was ancient and aware and deeply hostile to our presence. After nearly 3 hours of descent, Ben's voice, tense and quiet, cut through the silence of the control room. I have it. Bottom contact. We're about 100 meters off the seafloor. And, oh my God. He brought the ROV's descent to a halt. He slowly panned the camera. And there it was. It wasn't just an object on a sonar screen anymore. It was real. The lights of Hades cut through the eternal darkness and fell upon a wall of metal. It was vast, a curved, black cliff face rising from the silt of the seafloor. We were looking at the side of the submarine. It was covered in a thin layer of silt and a strange bioluminescent fungus that pulsed with a soft, sickly green light. But underneath, the hull was a smooth, matte black, made of a metal that didn't seem to have a single spot of rust or corrosion on it. This was our direct contact with the past tragedy, with the wreck itself. We flew Hades along the length of the hull, our cameras drinking in every detail. And the discrepancies, the things that didn't add up, began to accumulate. The first was the design. It was sleek, impossibly advanced, with no visible weld seams. It looked less like it was built and more like it was grown. The second was the lack of any recognizable military hardware. We flew the entire length of the port side. There were no torpedo tubes, No missile hatches, no conning tower. It was a weapon of war with no weapons. And then we saw the markings. They were not Russian. They were not Cyrillic. They were a series of strange, complex, geometric symbols etched into the hull, almost like a circuit diagram. They glowed faintly with the same green light as the fungus that grew on them. Ben zoomed in on one of the symbols. "I've never seen anything like that," he whispered. "It's not a language. It looks more like a warning label." We found a viewport, a thick, circular window made of a material that looked like smoked quartz. It was cracked, a spider web of fractures running through it, but it was still intact. This was our first glimpse inside. Ben maneuvered the ROV right up to the window, its lights piercing the darkness within. The cliffhanger, the single potent object that redefined the entire mystery, was what we saw inside. It was not a control room. It was not an engine room or a crew quarters. The entire vast interior of the submarine, as far as our lights could penetrate, was a single, massive, empty space. And in the center of that space was a cage, a colossal, heavily reinforced containment cell, built of the same black metal as the hull. Its walls were lined with the same glowing green symbols. The door to the cell was immense, a slab of metal that had to be 20 feet thick. It looked like a cell designed to hold a god, or a devil. And we realized, in a single, heart-stopping moment of collective dread, the truth. This was not a submarine. This was a transport. This was a prison. This was a paddy wagon built to move a single, unbelievably dangerous prisoner from one place to another, in the only place in the world remote and secure enough to do so: the bottom of the ocean. The revelation that the wreck was a prison sent a shockwave of stunned silence through the ROV control room. The concept was so alien, so far outside the realm of our scientific understanding, that our minds struggled to find purchase. A submarine prison, a mobile Alcatraz for a single, unknown entity. We stared at the image on the screen, the vast, empty interior, the glowing runes, the colossal, silent cell, and 1,000 frantic questions began to fire in our brains. Who built this thing? When? And the most terrifying question of all, what did they build it to contain? Our first night was not a passage of time, but a period of profound and terrifying reevaluation. We were no longer oceanographers studying a wreck. We were archaeologists who had stumbled upon a tomb, only to find that the tomb had been built to keep a monster in, not to honor the dead. We were all on edge, our professional calm shattered. The control room, once a place of quiet, focused science, was now a pressure cooker of fear and adrenaline. The false alarms began, our own overstimulated minds playing tricks on us. A flicker on one of the secondary monitors would make us jump, convinced we had seen movement inside the wreck. The low hum of the ship's electronics would seem for a moment to form a low, guttural word. Ben, ever the scientist, was the first to try and reimpose logic on the situation. "It's a containment vessel, obviously," he said, his voice a little too loud, a little too forced. For nuclear waste, or a biological agent, a doomsday weapon. That's what it has to be. A top-secret Soviet project to transport something incredibly dangerous. And it failed. He was building a cage of logic, a rational explanation to contain the impossible truth we were facing. But his explanation didn't account for the glowing runes, or the sheer, impossible scale of the cell. You don't build a cell that big for a vial of smallpox. The sounds became our next source of terror. Not sounds from the wreck, but sounds from our own equipment. The hydrophone on the ROV, which had been registering nothing but the faint, ambient hiss of the deep ocean, suddenly began to pick up a new sound. It was a faint, rhythmic, and deeply unnatural noise. A soft, wet, scraping sound. It was intermittent, coming and going, and it had no clear source. It sounded to my horrified mind like the sound of something immense, something with a chitinous shell, dragging itself across the seafloor, somewhere out there in the darkness, just beyond the range of our lights. The direct contact, the shocking visual moment that moved us from terrified speculation to raw, immediate fear, happened when we decided to maneuver the ROV to the other side of the wreck. If it was a failed transport, there had to be signs of an accident, of a catastrophic failure. It took nearly an hour to circumnavigate the massive hull, our ROV moving with a slow, deliberate caution. The starboard side of the wreck was a mirror image of the port side, a vast, featureless expanse of black, uncorroded metal. And then we saw the damage. It was not a small rupture. It was a colossal, gaping hole torn in the side of the hull, easily 40 feet in diameter. It looked like the wreck had been hit by a meteor. But as we brought Hades closer, we saw the detail that turned our fear into pure, undiluted terror. The thick, laminated layers of the hull were not buckled or pushed inward, as they would be from an external explosion or a catastrophic pressure failure. They were bent, twisted, and peeled outward, violently. The metal was curled back like the lid of a tin can that had been ripped open from the inside. Whatever had been in that cell, it had not been a passive payload. It had been a prisoner, and it had broken out. We stared at the breach, a ragged, gaping wound in the side of the prison, our minds frozen. The sheer, physical force required to tear through a hull that had withstood the pressure of 7 miles of ocean was incomprehensible. It was the force of a tectonic plate, of a nuclear explosion, and it had come from within. I found my voice, a dry, croaking whisper. "Ben, get the ROV's camera inside the hole. I need to see." Ben complied, his hands moving with a stiff, robotic precision. He flew Hades carefully through the jagged opening, into the black, silent interior of the prison. The beams of our lights cut through the darkness, and we saw the cell. We were looking at it from the inside now, and the massive 20-foot thick steel door was gone. It had not been unlocked. It had been ripped from its hinges and lay 100 feet away, bent and twisted into a pretzel of scrap metal. The cell was empty. The cage was broken. The prisoner was free. The cliffhanger, the indisputable proof that validated our fear and transformed it from a historical discovery into a clear and present danger, came from the sonar. As we were reeling from the sight of the empty cell, a piercing alarm suddenly blared through the control room. It was the ROV's active sonar, which we had set to a wide, passive search pattern. A new contact had appeared on the screen. It was a massive, single biological signature. The computer estimated its size as indeterminate, but the raw data suggested something that was easily over 1,000 feet long. It was moving away from the wreck, away from us, into the deep darkness of the trench. And it was moving at a speed of over 150 knots. An impossible, physics-defying speed for any biological creature in the crushing pressure of the abyss. We had not just found an empty prison. We had arrived just moments after the jailbreak. And the prisoner was now loose in our ocean. The piercing shriek of the sonar alarm was a declaration of war. The game had changed, instantly and irrevocably. We were no longer investigators of a historical mystery. We were witnesses to a live event. The what had been answered. A creature of unimaginable size and power had been held in a secret deep-sea prison, and it had just escaped. The new, terrifying question was, what now? My immediate instinctual reaction was to fall back on my training as a scientist. We had data, a sonar contact, a speed, a trajectory. "Ben, I yelled, my voice sharp, cutting through the stunned silence of the control room. "Track it! I need a course and a speed. Now. Get every sensor on the ROV pointed in that direction. I want a full spectrum analysis. Give me everything you've got." The investigation became a frantic, desperate scramble for information. Ben's hands flew across his keyboard. His earlier cynicism burned away and replaced by the pure, focused adrenaline of a scientist confronting a paradigm-shattering discovery. He was no longer a skeptic. He was a believer. The sonar contact was a solid, undeniable fact, a beautiful, terrifying red slash moving across his monitor. 160 knots, he said, his voice a mixture of awe and terror. It's not accelerating. It just is. It went from a dead stop to 160 knots instantly. That's not possible. The water resistance alone. The physics are all wrong. The labyrinth, the prison, was not a place of broken geometry, but of broken biology. The near misses, the moments of building dread, came from the data streams pouring in from the ROV's sensors. We were trying to get a picture of the creature, but it was moving too fast and was already at the edge of our sensor range. We couldn't see it, but we could feel its passage. The ROV's hydrophone was picking up a low-frequency pressure wave, the wake of the creature's movement through the water. A sound so low and so powerful it was more of a feeling, a deep, gut-vibrating thrum that seemed to shake the very hull of the Odyssey, 7 miles above. The temperature sensors on the ROV registered a sudden, transient spike in the ambient water temperature. The creature was leaving a thermal trail, a ghost of heat in the freezing abyss. It was radiating energy on an immense scale. The search for the central artifact, the key to understanding what this thing was, led us back to the wreck itself. The creature was gone, but the prison remained. This was our only clue. This was the only piece of physical evidence we had. "Get us back to the wreck, Ben," I ordered. "I need close-ups of those symbols. The ones on the hull, the ones inside the cell. They're not just warnings. They're part of the containment system. I have to know how it worked." The investigation turned into a frantic, last-ditch effort to understand the cage, in the desperate hope that it would tell us something about the nature of the beast that had escaped from it. We flew Hades back to the wreck, its lights playing over the strange, glowing green runes. I had Ben take hundreds of high-resolution still photographs from every conceivable angle. This was our Rosetta Stone, our only hope. The direct contact with the recorded past was not from a logbook, but from the wreck itself. As we were documenting the symbols, the ROV's manipulator arm, which Ben was using to steady the vehicle against the hull, accidentally scraped against one of the glowing green lines. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. A brilliant, silent flash of green light erupted from the symbol. Every electronic system in the ROV control room went haywire. Our monitors filled with static. Our speakers emitted a deafening screech of electronic feedback. And then, every screen went black. We were blind. We had lost the feed from Hades. "What happened?" Captain Larson yelled from the back of the room. "I've lost the feed!" "Ben, what did you do?" Ben was frantically trying to re-establish the connection. "I don't know," he shouted. "The arm just touched one of the symbols. It was like a short circuit. A massive energy discharge. I'm trying to reboot the system." For 5 agonizingly long minutes, we were in the dark, both literally and figuratively. The only light in the control room was the red glow of the emergency exit signs. The only sound was the frantic clicking of Ben's keyboard and the ragged sound of our own breathing. We had no idea what was happening to our multi-million-dollar ROV 7 miles below us. And then, with a flicker, one of the monitors came back to life. It was not the main camera feed. It was a secondary low-resolution engineering camera, one we used for monitoring the ROV's own systems. The image was grainy, washed out and distorted by static, but it was a view. We were looking out from the side of the ROV. The wreck was gone. We were no longer near it. The ROV was tumbling end over end in the blackness, clearly out of control. And then we saw it. The cliffhanger. The final, horrifying revelation. Drifting through the marine snow, caught in the faint, dying glow of the ROV's damaged lights, was a piece of debris. A large, twisted plate of the black, unrustable metal from the prison's hull, and etched into it, glowing with a faint, malevolent green light, was a single, perfect symbol. It was not a complex rune. It was a stylized, geometric drawing of a star system. A star system with 9 planets. A system I recognized instantly from my college astronomy textbooks. It was Sol, our solar system. And the 3rd planet from the sun was circled. It was not a warning label. It was not a circuit diagram. It was a destination. It was an address. The prison hadn't been built by Russians or Americans. It hadn't even been built by humans. And the prisoner had just been told the way home. The sight of that impossible star chart, a map of our own solar system etched onto the hull of a non-human prison, was the moment our reality completely and irrevocably fractured. The control room of the Odyssey fell into a stunned, breathless silence. The only sound, the faint, desperate hiss of static from our dead monitors. The implications were too vast, too monstrous to fully comprehend. This wasn't just a discovery. It was a revelation that repositioned humanity's place in the cosmos. We were not the masters of our world. We were, at best, clueless tenants, living in a house that had a monster locked in the basement, a monster whose existence we hadn't even suspected, and the landlord had just been informed of our address. This act of our terrifying story was a slow, agonizing descent into the voices from the past, but our past was not human. The artifact we were now forced to study was the single, grainy, looping image on our one remaining monitor, and the flood of terrifying implications it unleashed in our own minds. For what felt like an eternity, we just stared at that image, the tumbling ROV, the blackness of the abyss, and that single glowing piece of wreckage with its terrifying familiar map. We were no longer scientists. We were theologians, staring at a piece of a fallen angel's wing, trying to comprehend the nature of the God who had cast it down. The building dread was no longer about what was outside the ship, but what was now inside our heads. The certainties that had governed our lives, the laws of physics, the history of human technological development, the belief in our own species' primacy, had been systematically dismantled. We began to speak in low, hushed tones, as if afraid the very air might be listening. Ben, the arch-skeptic, was the most deeply affected. His entire worldview, a carefully constructed edifice of data and rationalism, had been demolished. He began to obsess over the star chart. "It's not just a map," he whispered, his eyes wide, his face illuminated by the sickly green glow of the monitor. "It's a power source. Don't you see? The symbols on the hull, they weren't just decorative. They were the containment field, a circuit, and the map. The map was the master switch. A destination lock? The prison was designed to be inert, to be powerless, until it reached a predetermined destination. Our solar system. Us." As he spoke, the very ship around us seemed to join the psychological assault. A sudden, violent shudder ran through the hull of the Odyssey, a deep, resonant groan of stressed metal. Captain Larson's voice, tight with alarm, crackled over the ship's intercom. "All hands, be advised. We are experiencing unusual deep water currents. secure all loose gear. But we, in the control room, knew it wasn't a current. It was the wake. The creature, the escaped prisoner, though miles away, was a force of nature so powerful that its passage was warping the very ocean around it, its psychic resonance echoing up from the abyss to shake our tiny, fragile vessel. The escalation came when Ben, in a fit of obsessive, desperate genius, managed to restore a single, corrupted data file from the ROV's hard drive just before the blackout. It wasn't a video file. It was an audio file, a 2-second-long snippet from the hydrophone recorded in the instant before the energy discharge. He bypassed the main speakers and played it on a small, tinny engineering monitor. The sound that came out was not a roar or a scream. It was a voice. A clear, impossibly ancient, and deeply intelligent voice, speaking in a language that was a cascade of complex, clicking, and sibilant sounds. But underneath the alien phonetics, the emotional intent was unmistakable. It was a single word, spoken with a tone of triumphant, exultant, and utterly malevolent joy. It was the sound of a prisoner, after eons of silent captivity, finally tasting freedom. The sound itself was a weapon. It seemed to rewire my brain, filling me with a sudden, irrational, and overwhelming sense of absolute dread. A primal, animal fear of a predator so ancient and so powerful that my hindbrain recognized it even if my conscious mind could not. This was the cliffhanger, the single most terrifying and game-changing revelation from the artifact. We now had a voice for our monster. We had proof of its intelligence. And as we sat there, reeling from the sound of that triumphant alien word, the final piece of the puzzle fell into my own mind. I was the senior scientist, the expert in deep ocean phenomena. And I finally understood the connection between the wreck, the creature, and the strange magnetic and thermal anomalies we had been detecting. The wreck, the prison, wasn't just a cage. It was a damper, a suppressor field. For 65 million years, or however long it had been lying on the seafloor, it had been actively containing not just the creature's body, but its aura, its effect on the physical world. And now that the creature was free, the suppressor field was gone. The creature was no longer just a biological entity. It was a walking, swimming, physics-altering event, a localized reality warp, and it was moving. The final log entry wasn't a scream from a scientist. It was a dawning, terrible realization in my own mind, which I spoke aloud into the silent, terrified room. We were wrong. We didn't just find an escaped prisoner. We witnessed the release of a disease that infects reality itself. And by observing it, by touching its cage, we have just rung a dinner bell for a creature that doesn't just eat flesh. It eats physics. My final, terrible pronouncement that we had unleashed a physics-altering disease upon the world sucked the last remaining oxygen from the control room. The labyrinth, our personal hell, was now the entire Pacific Ocean. The entity, the Warden's prisoner, no longer needed to be near us to begin its assault. Now aware that it was being observed, that its freedom had been witnessed, it abandoned stealth and launched a direct, personal, and horrifyingly subtle assault on our psyches. The attacks were explicitly tied to my internal baggage, my identity as a scientist who had dedicated her life to the rational, observable, and predictable nature of the ocean. The Warden began to systematically dismantle my understanding of the sea, turning my greatest love and my life's work into an instrument of terror. The building dread began not with a bang, but with a change in the water itself. I was on the bridge with Captain Larson, staring out at the ocean. The sea, which had been a normal, deep blue, began to look wrong. The texture of the surface seemed too smooth, too glassy, like a sheet of obsidian. The waves seemed to move in a slow, unnatural, almost rehearsed rhythm. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible wrongness. The kind of detail only someone who had spent 30 years staring at the ocean would even notice. It looked like a cheap computer-generated imitation of the sea. The Warden was not just a creature in the ocean. It was beginning to edit the ocean itself, to overwrite the reality of the water with its own alien code. The manipulations escalated into full-blown waking nightmares, each one a perversion of my scientific knowledge. I was in my lab, looking at a water sample we had taken earlier. Under the microscope, the diatoms and plankton, the tiny, beautiful, jewel-like building blocks of marine life, were behaving erratically. They were no longer drifting randomly. They were arranging themselves into patterns, the same complex, geometric, runic patterns we had seen on the hull of the prison. The Warden was communicating with me, not through words, but through the language of biology, the very language I was an expert in. It was turning my own field of study into a medium for its own terrifying message. The line between what was a natural phenomenon and what was a direct, intelligent manipulation completely dissolved. The direct contact came that night. I was in my cabin, unable to sleep, staring up my porthole at the black, glassy water, and I saw a light, a faint, bioluminescent green glow deep beneath the surface, the same sickly green as the runes on the prison. It was moving, pacing our ship, a single baleful eye in the abyss. And then it began to rise. It grew larger, brighter, until it was a vast, luminous shape just beneath the hull. And it communicated with me, not by mimicking a voice, but by arranging the very stuff of the ocean. The water directly outside my porthole began to glow, and the plankton, the tiny creatures of the sea, swarmed together, their collective bioluminescence forming a single, complex, and terrifying image against the blackness of the water. It was an image of the Odyssey, a perfect, detailed, three-dimensional model of our ship. And then I watched in horror as the image of our ship was slowly, deliberately, and systematically crushed, crumpled, and pulled apart by an unseen, invisible force. It was not just trying to scare me. It was showing me what it was capable of. It was showing me our future. Pushed to the brink of insanity by this relentless, silent, and deeply personal assault, I committed my catastrophic, irreversible mistake. I was in the main lab with Ben. He had been working for hours, trying to analyze the 2-second audio clip of the Warden's voice. He was convinced that if he could break down the linguistic structure of the word, he could find a key, a clue to its nature. "It's not just a sound, Alani," he was saying, his voice a frantic, obsessive whisper. "It's a waveform, a complex, data-rich waveform. It's a key. I know it is." He had isolated the waveform and was displaying it on his main monitor. It was a jagged, complex, and deeply alien-looking shape. And as I stared at it, the Warden launched its final, most devastating attack. The waveform on the screen began to subtly, almost imperceptibly, pulse. A slow, rhythmic, hypnotic pulse of green light. I felt a wave of dizziness, of nausea. The air in the lab grew thick and heavy, and I saw Ben, my brilliant, cynical, and grounded colleague, my only intellectual ally in this nightmare, begin to change. His eyes went glassy and unfocused. A thin, faint, green luminescence, the same green as the runes, began to glow just beneath his skin. "The key," he whispered, his voice no longer his own. It was a flat, synthesized, sexless monotone, the voice of the labyrinth. "The key opens the door, and the door is you." He turned to face me, and on his face was a smile of pure, ecstatic, and inhuman joy. The Warden was no longer just outside the ship. It was inside my friend. It had found a way in, and in a fit of pure, primal terror, a desperate animal instinct to stop the infection from spreading, I grabbed a heavy, steel fire extinguisher from the wall, and I swung it with all my strength at the main computer console, at the screen that was displaying the hypnotic, pulsing waveform. The screen shattered in a shower of sparks, and Ben, my friend, collapsed to the floor, his body going rigid, the green light under his skin flickering once, and then dying. I had broken the connection, but I had also just destroyed our only sample of the Warden's voice, our only piece of primary data, and I had no idea if I had saved Ben or if I had just killed him. The shattering of the monitor was a sound that broke the world. The immediate, disastrous consequence of my action was a profound, terrifying silence in the lab, broken only by the crackle of dying electronics and the soft, ragged sound of my own breathing. Ben lay motionless on the floor, his face pale and still, the alien green luminescence gone. I rushed to his side, my heart hammering against my ribs. I checked his pulse. It was there, faint and thready, but it was there. He was alive, unconscious, but alive. I had not killed him, but I had severed our last, best hope of understanding our enemy. The point of no return had been crossed. The data was gone. The containment of my own scientific composure was breached. I was no longer an observer. I was a combatant, and I had just fired my only bullet into the dark. The period of profound and terrible silence that followed this disaster was a time of grim, terrified waiting. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that I had not defeated the Warden. I had only angered it. I had destroyed its new toy, its new puppet, and the dread came from the simple, terrifying anticipation of its response. We were no longer just being haunted. We'd invited the monster inside, and then we had slapped it in the face. What would it do next? The Warden's response was not subtle. It transitioned instantly from a campaign of psychological games to one of overt, overwhelming physical aggression. It was no longer a ghost in the machine. It was a tangible physical force in our world, and its weapon was the ocean itself. The sea around the Odyssey, which had been unnaturally calm and glassy, erupted into a violent, chaotic fury. A rogue wave, a wall of water 50 feet high, rose out of the placid sea and slammed into our ship, not from a distance but forming directly beside us. The Odyssey was thrown onto its side, the sound of groaning, twisting steel, a deafening roar. In the lab, equipment tore loose from its moorings, crashing across the deck. I was thrown against a bulkhead, the impact stealing the air from my lungs. The ship's alarms, a cacophony of bells and sirens, began to blare. The Warden was trying to sink us. It was trying to drag us down to its level. The direct, physical, and violent encounter with the anomaly was now a battle for the life of the ship. I managed to drag Ben's unconscious form out of the ruined lab and into the main passageway, where Captain Larson and the rest of the crew were fighting to save the vessel. The lights were flickering, cutting in and out, plunging us into intermittent strobes of darkness and emergency red lighting. The ship was being battered, not by a storm, but by a focused, intelligent, and malevolent force. Heavy objects, unsecured crates, and pieces of broken equipment were being thrown across the passageways by the violent lurches of the ship. It was a gauntlet of deadly, flying debris. We were forced to run, to hide, to crawl from one section of the ship to another, as the ocean itself, under the Warden's direct control, tried to tear us apart. There were no other, secondary characters to die. The entire crew of the Odyssey was now a single, terrified entity, fighting for its collective life. The Warden did not pick us off one by one. It was trying to kill us all at once, to drown us in the wreckage of our own ship. We managed to make it to the bridge. The scene was one of chaos. The windows were shattered and a torrent of cold seawater was pouring in. Captain Larson was at the helm, his face a mask of grim determination, his knuckles white as he fought to keep the ship from capsizing. And through the shattered windows, we could see it. The Warden was no longer just a light in the water. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, a part of it breached the surface. It was not a creature of flesh and blood. It was a thing of impossible, shifting liquid geometry. A wave that was also a claw. A vortex of black water that had a cold, green, intelligent light at its heart. It was the ocean itself, given form and malice. The cliffhanger, the moment of complete despair that crystallized into a cold, hard resolve, came when the engines died. There was a final, shuddering groan from the depths of the ship, and the low, reassuring thrum that had been the background music of our lives for weeks went silent. We were dead in the water. The emergency power was failing. The alarms sputtered and died. We were adrift, crippled, at the mercy of a creature that commanded the very sea around us. We were going to sink. We were going to die. And in the sudden, terrible silence of the dead bridge, surrounded by the wreckage of my scientific world and the terrified faces of the crew, I realized there was only one thing left to do. I wasn't going to run anymore. I wasn't going to hide. I was going to the source. But the source was not the creature in the water. The source was the prison it had escaped from. I had to go back. I had to get back to the wreck. I had to understand how to build the cage again. The decision to go back down, to descend into the abyss once more, was the single most insane idea of my life. The Odyssey was a crippled, sinking wreck. Our ROV, Hades, was lost. Its fiber optic tether snapped during the violent assault. We had no way to get back to the wreck, no way to reach the lair. My desperate preparation for this final confrontation was a frantic, desperate inventory of what little we had left. The ship was taking on water, listing heavily to port. Captain Larson and his crew were fighting a losing battle to keep us afloat, patching breaches, manning manual pumps. My lair was 7 miles down, and my only way to get there was a last, forgotten piece of technology in our hold. It was called the Deep Sea, a 2-person submersible, a tiny, spherical craft designed for shallow water observation. It was practically a museum piece, a relic from the 70s we sometimes use for coral reef surveys. Its maximum safe depth was rated at 2,000 feet. To take it into the Philippine Trench was not a suicide mission. It was just suicide. But it had its own independent power source, and it had 2 small, grappling manipulator arms. It was my only option. The journey to the lair, the preparation for this final, desperate dive, was a terrifying gauntlet. The ship was a death trap, the passageways slick with seawater, the emergency lights flickering and dying. Ben was still unconscious, being tended to by the ship's medic. I had to get to the submersible bay on the lowest deck, a section of the ship that was already beginning to flood. Captain Larson was against it. He thought I'd lost my mind. "You'll be crushed like a grape before you get a mile down, Doctor!" He yelled at me over the shriek of tearing metal. "It's a death trap!" "We're already in a death trap, Captain," I yelled back. "This is the only chance we have. I have to get back to that wreck. I have to understand the containment. It's the only way to stop this thing." He saw the look in my eyes, the cold, hard certainty of a person with nothing left to lose. He gave me a single, grim nod. He would buy me as much time as he could. The final guardian I had to face before I could even begin my descent was a puzzle of mechanics and rising water. The submersible bay was flooding with icy seawater. The launch mechanism for the deep sea was powered by the ship's main hydraulic system, which was now dead. The only way to launch it was to use the manual release levers, a complex sequence that required 2 people. But there was only me. I was alone, up to my waist in freezing water. the tiny yellow submersible bobbing in its cradle like a rubber duck in a hurricane. I had to use a combination of wrenches, pry bars, and my own dwindling strength to bypass the hydraulic locks. It was a race against the rising water and the failing integrity of the ship. Inch by inch, lever by lever, I managed to release the clamps. The final release was a massive, rusted lever that I had to throw with my entire body weight. It moved with a tortured groan, and the submersible was free. I scrambled into the tiny, cramped cockpit, sealed the hatch above me, and watched as the bay around me filled completely with water. For a moment, I was in a tiny, yellow bubble, trapped inside a sinking ship. Then a section of the bay door, weakened by the Warden's assault, gave way, and my tiny submersible was spewed out into the open, violent ocean. I was free from the ship, but now I was in a tiny, fragile sphere, being tossed around by a sea that was actively trying to kill me. I engaged the thrusters, fighting the unnatural currents, and began my descent. The submersible groaned and creaked around me, the acrylic viewport crazing under the immense pressure. Every 100 feet, a new alarm would sound. A new system would threaten to fail. The journey down was a constant, terrifying battle against the laws of physics. But I was driven by a single, obsessive thought. The symbols, the containment field, the prison. I had to see it again. I had to understand it. After what felt like a lifetime, after descending far, far beyond the submersible's crushed depth, into a realm of pressure my tiny craft was never designed to withstand, I reached the bottom. The submersible systems were all screaming, the hull groaning like a dying animal. But I was there. My single weak headlight cut a tiny, pathetic cone into the absolute darkness, and in the distance, I saw it. The faint, sickly green glow of the wreck. The lair. I paused, took a final shuddering breath in the recycled stale air of my cockpit, and piloted my dying craft towards the prison. The act ends as I approach the wreck, my tiny yellow submersible a firefly next to a fallen god, the great, gaping, outward-facing hole in its side, a silent, screaming testament to the power of the creature. I was now, somehow, supposed to stop. My arrival at the wreck in the dying, groaning shell of the deep sea was not a triumph. It was the last, twitching act of a doomed man. The lair was exactly as we had left it, a vast, silent, and impossibly ancient monument to a cosmic failure. The rich, detailed, and terrifying description of the entity's presence was not in what I saw, but in what the wreck now represented. It was a broken cage, a shattered lock, and I, a primitive ape with a stone tool, had come to try and fix it. The sheer, insane arrogance of my mission was crushing. I piloted the submersible, its alarms now a constant shrieking chorus closer to the great gaping hole in the hull. The green, bioluminescent runes seemed to pulse with a slow, mocking rhythm, their light the only illumination in this eternal night. My ultimate confrontation was not with the Warden itself, but with the ghost it had left behind. Its prison. I had to understand the lock. I maneuvered the tiny submersible through the jagged opening into the vast, silent interior. The great, empty cell sat in the center of the space, its door a twisted ruin of metal, a testament to the prisoner's power. My goal was simple. I had to get a sample, a piece of the material the cell was made of, a piece of the technology that had held a physics-altering god captive for millennia. It was my only hope. If I could get a sample back to the surface, if someone could analyze it, understand it, maybe, just maybe, they could build a new cage. The final revelation, the last devastating piece of the puzzle, came as I approached the inner wall of the cell, My submersible's weak headlight played over the surface, and I saw something that we had missed in the frantic, terrifying moments of our first visit. Etched into the wall of the cell, almost invisible amongst the complex glowing runes, was another set of markings. They were not the elegant geometric symbols of the containment field. They were crude, scratched, gouged into the black metal with what must have been unimaginable force. They were the prisoner's graffiti. The frantic scratchings of a being trapped in a box for longer than our species has existed. And they were not alien. They were horrifyingly familiar. They were equations. Complex, multi-dimensional physics equations written in a mathematical language that was centuries beyond our own. But I could understand the basics of it, and what I saw made the blood in my veins turn to ice. The prisoner had not been idle in its cage. It had been working. It had been studying its prison. It had been reverse engineering the technology of its own containment. And the final equation, the one that was scratched into the wall with a triumphant, terrible finality, was the one that described how to create a resonant cascade failure in the containment field. The prisoner had not broken out through sheer, brute force. It had solved the puzzle of its own lock. It had learned the magic word. It had thought its way out of prison. The final act, my sacrificial plan, was born of this last, terrible knowledge. I understood now. The Warden was not just a creature of immense power. It was a creature of immense, terrifying intelligence. And it was free. There was no building a new cage. There was no stopping it. Humanity had had its time, and that time was now over. My final desperate act was not one of hope. It was one of spite. It was an act of pure, human defiance against the dying of the light. I was not going to let it get away clean. I had to leave a message, a warning, a scar on this pristine, terrible crime scene. I used the submersible's small, clumsy manipulator arms, and I broke off a piece of the inner wall of the cell, a small black fragment containing the prisoner's triumphant final equation. I secured the sample in the submersible's collection basket. Then I turned my attention to the submersible itself. Its power was almost gone. Its hull was groaning, about to implode. It was my coffin, and it was now my weapon. I aimed the tiny craft at the far wall of the prison, at the twisted ruined door, and I engaged the thrusters, one last time, at full power. The story ends at the absolute peak of this action. My tiny submersible, my coffin, my final defiant message, shot forward like a tiny yellow bullet. The alarms shrieked their final desperate warning. The acrylic viewport in front of me cracked, then shattered, and the crushing, black, silent water of the abyss rushed in. A blinding, silent, and utterly final wave of pressure. Then, abrupt, total silence, and darkness. The narrative cuts off completely my fate, and the fate of the single vital clue I had gathered, completely, terrifyingly, unknown. My story should have ended there, in a silent implosion 7 miles beneath the waves. My awakening was a physical impossibility, a violation of every law of physics I held dear. I remember a sensation not of light, but of decompression, a feeling of being pulled, stretched, and then violently reconstituted. I awoke on the deck of a ship, gasping, coughing up seawater, the noon sun searing my eyes. But it was not the deck of the RV Odyssey. It was a gray, featureless steel deck, and the men standing over me were not scientists. They were soldiers, clad in matte black combat gear with no insignia, their faces hidden behind dark, polarized visors. The ship was a sleek, black, unmarked vessel that looked more like a stealth bomber than a seafaring craft. I was no longer in the hands of NOAA. I was in the hands of the real authorities, the ones who had known about the prison all along. They told me the Odyssey had been lost with all hands, a tragic victim of the same rogue wave that had crippled it. A convenient fiction. They told me that the deep-sea submersible had been found, floating on the surface, its cockpit miraculously intact, its emergency beacon activated. I knew this was a lie. My submersible had been my coffin, my battering ram. The story they told me was not for my benefit. It was the official story, the one they were testing on me, the one that would become the historical record. My debriefing was not a series of questions. It was a series of statements. It took place in a room deep inside the ship, a room that was a perfect, sterile cube, where they informed me of my new reality. They had the sample I had recovered, the small, black fragment of the cell wall with the Warden's equations scratched onto it. They treated it with a terror and a reverence that confirmed my worst fears. They knew exactly what it was. The horror of this epilogue was not supernatural. It was a cold, quiet, bureaucratic horror. The men who debriefed me were from the Pentagon, from a department so secret it was known only as the Office of Unacknowledged Special Projects. They were the keepers of the real secrets, the janitors who cleaned up after humanity had stumbled into a room it was not supposed to enter. They didn't need to threaten me. They simply laid out the facts. They told me the wreck was not a secret from the Cold War. It was a secret from the dawn of time. It had been discovered in 1947 by the USS Norton Sound, its immense magnetic anomaly detected during a deep-sea survey. For over 50 years, a covert, multinational coalition, a secret organization operating under the protection of the Pentagon and other world powers, had been studying it. They called it Object Warden. Their mission was not to understand it, but simply to ensure that it remained undisturbed. They were the jailers. And we, a hapless team of civilian scientists, had blundered into their prison and witnessed the escape. My life was forfeit, but they did not kill me. I was too valuable. I was the only living human to have seen the inside of the cell, to have seen the Warden's graffiti. They gave me a new name, a new identity, and a new job. I spent the next 15 years of my life in a gilded cage, a deep underground research facility near White Sands, New Mexico, working with a team of other ghost scientists. Our singular, obsessive, and terrifying task was to try and understand the fragment I had brought back, to translate the Warden's mathematics, to understand the physics of the containment field. We were trying to learn how to build a cage for a god, using a piece of the cage it had already learned how to break. And now, I jump forward to today. I am no longer in that facility. 5 years ago, I was retired. My health was failing, and my knowledge was deemed to be complete. They moved me here, to this anonymous house, to live out my final days in quiet, monitored isolation. The long-term psychological scars of my experience are profound. I suffer from a form of reverse claustrophobia. I cannot stand open spaces. I feel safest in small, enclosed rooms. I look at the vast open sky, and I do not see freedom. I see an endless, empty space that a creature of infinite power and intelligence is now free to roam. I look at the ocean and I see not a source of life, but an empty cage, a crime scene. I am a ghost in my own world, haunted by the knowledge of what is now loose in it. I am turning off this recording now. I have told you everything I can. I have broken my oaths, my silence, because of that press release about the USS Trident. They are not going back to salvage anything. They are going back because they have to. The fragment I brought back, the Warden's equations, we were never able to fully translate them. But we learned one thing. The containment field, the prison, was not just designed to hold the creature. It was also a tracker, a cosmic GPS tag. And for the last 5 years, a deep space listening array, an off-the-books DARPA project has been detecting a faint, repeating signal coming from the direction of the Proxima Centauri system. It is a signal that matches the resonant frequency of the Warden's own biology. The prisoner is not just wandering. It is not just hunting. It is calling home. And the most terrifying secret of all, the reason the Navy is going back, is that last month, for the first time in 65 million years, something answered. They gave me a new name, a new life, and told me to forget what I had found. But I can't. Because sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and I look up at the stars, I know that they are no longer just distant points of light. They are the street lights on a road, and something is coming down that road, coming home. So that's the story of Object Warden, a story that reminds us that the greatest mysteries aren't about what lies beyond the stars, but what has been sleeping in the crushing darkness of our own world, right under our feet. It's a story that proves that not all shipwrecks are tombs for the dead. Some are prisons for things that can't die. The official story is that the RV Odyssey was lost in a tragic accident. But now you and I know the truth. They didn't just discover a wreck. They stumbled upon an open cage and witnessed the first moments of a freedom that has been awaited for eons. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story made you think or look over your shoulder, support the channel with a like and subscribe. And be sure to share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, remember that the deepest parts of our world are older and stranger than we can possibly imagine. And sometimes, it's best to let sleeping monsters lie, especially when you find their prison and the door has been torn open from the inside.